My name is Clara Voss and I was 31 years old, standing in a lawyer's office in a black dress I hadn't taken off in 4 days, when I found out my parents had signed away my grandmother's estate to my brother 6 weeks before she died. Not after. Before. While she was still breathing. While I was still driving 2 hours each way to sit beside her bed and read to her from the book she kept on her nightstand. While my husband was dying in a different hospital 40 minutes in the other direction and I was splitting myself in half trying to be in both rooms at once. Daniel died on a Thursday. My grandmother followed 11 days later. The will reading was scheduled for a Friday morning, 10 days after that. I remember the date because it was the same day I finally returned the sympathy cards stacked on my kitchen counter. I hadn't been able to open them before then. I walked into that office believing I was there to hear my grandmother's final wishes. I walked out knowing that her final wishes had been quietly rewritten while I was too busy grieving to notice. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the lawyer's office. Not to the hospital. Further back. To a kitchen table in a yellow house on Birchwood Lane, and a grandmother who saw everything coming long before I did. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, was the kind of woman who ironed her pillowcases and remembered the birthday of every person she had ever loved. She lived alone in the yellow house on Birchwood Lane for 19 years after my grandfather passed. The house had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs she never removed, even through winter, and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee and something baking even when the oven was cold. I spent every summer of my childhood in that house. My brother Reese did not. That wasn't a secret or a point of tension when we were young. It was simply true the way some things are simply true in families. Reese was 12 years older than me. He had a life, then a career, then a second career when the first one failed, then a third that he described differently depending on who was asking. He called himself a consultant. My grandmother called him ambitious. My mother called him visionary. My father called him son in a voice he never quite used for anything else. I called him absent. Reese hadn't visited our grandmother more than 4 or 5 times in the last decade. I knew this because I was there almost every other month, and his absence was something Eleanor and I had learned to navigate around, the way you navigate around a piece of furniture someone moved and never moved back. You stop expecting it in the old place. You just work around the gap. My grandmother never complained about Reese directly. She wasn't built for direct complaints. But sometimes, when I was washing the dishes after dinner and she was drying, she would say something careful and quiet that I understood to mean more than the words. He has his reasons, she would say. And then she would fold the dish towel and change the subject and I would let her because some things are more honest left half finished. Here's what you need to understand about my family before the rest of this makes sense. My parents, Gerald and Maureen Voss, were people who loved both their children but measured that love in different currencies. With me, it was consistency. Dependability. The steady assumption that Clara would handle whatever needed handling because Clara always had. With Reese, it was something else. Something louder and more expensive and harder to name. My father had grown up poor in a way that left a permanent watermark on everything he did afterward. He worked 34 years in manufacturing, saved carefully, never wasted, and raised 2 children in a house that was comfortable but never let you forget it had been earned. He was proud of that. He was more proud of Reese, who he believed had transcended it. Reese had the instincts of a man who understood exactly which version of himself each room required. Around investors, he was visionary. Around my parents, he was grateful and humble and still figuring it out. Around me, he was the older brother who had simply moved on to more important things and assumed I understood. I did understand. That was the problem. I understood it so completely that I had stopped expecting anything different from any of them. I met Daniel Hartley when I was 24. He was a high school history teacher with a truck that needed work and a laugh that made rooms feel smaller in the best way. We married in my grandmother's backyard on a Saturday in September. Eleanor sat in the front row in a blue dress and cried from the processional to the recessional and told me afterward she had never been so happy at a wedding in her life. My parents gave a toast. Reese sent a card. He had a conflict. He always had a conflict. Danielle and I built a quiet life. A house outside of Asheville, a garden that was mostly his project, dinner parties that were mostly mine. We had been trying for a baby for 2 years when Daniel was diagnosed. Pancreatic. Stage 3. He was 33 years old. I want to be honest with you about what that year looked like because I think it matters to understand what came after. I worked full-time as a property manager for a commercial real estate firm. I drove Daniel to treatment 3 times a week. I learned the language of oncology the way you learn a foreign language when you have no choice, fast and imperfectly and out of sheer necessity. I cooked things he could keep down. I slept in 4-hour increments. I answered emails at 2 in the morning and pretended on phone calls that everything was being handled because everything had to be handled. My parents called twice a week. They offered to come. I told them I was fine because telling them I wasn't would require a conversation I didn't have the energy for. My grandmother called every day. Not to ask how I was managing. She knew how I was managing. She called to read me the weather in Birchwood. To tell me what the cardinal outside her kitchen window had been doing. To describe what she was making for dinner in enough detail that I could almost smell it through the phone. She called to give me something that had nothing to do with what was falling apart. I didn't understand until much later what those calls were costing her. She was 81. She was already tired. But she got up every morning and she called her granddaughter because her granddaughter needed to hear a voice that wasn't afraid. 8 months into Daniel's treatment, Eleanor had a fall. Nothing dramatic. A missed step on the back porch, a bruised hip, a week in the hospital for observation. She was home within 10 days. But something shifted after that. She moved more carefully. She slept more. She started mentioning the yellow house in a different way, not as the place she lived but as the place she'd always lived, which sounded like the same thing but wasn't. I drove up to see her the weekend after she came home. We sat on the porch in the rocking chairs and drank coffee and she asked me about Daniel with the particular precision of someone who wanted the real answer, not the managed one. I gave her the real answer. She held my hand without saying anything for a long time. That evening, after dinner, she said something I stored away and didn't fully open until months later. Clara, she said, people show you who they are when things get hard. Not always in the big moments. Sometimes in the small ones. The calls they don't make. The drives they don't take. She wasn't talking about Daniel. I didn't ask who she was talking about. I already knew. What I didn't know was that 3 weeks after that visit, my parents drove to Birchwood Lane for a visit of their own. I found this out later. At the time, I wasn't told they were going. I wasn't asked to come. I was sitting in a treatment center waiting room with a paper cup of bad coffee and a magazine I wasn't reading while Daniel received his 4th round of treatment. My parents' visit to my grandmother lasted one afternoon. Reese was there. I pieced this together much later from a combination of what the attorney told me, what my grandmother's neighbor Agnes mentioned in passing, and what my father eventually admitted during a phone call that I don't think he intended to be as honest as it was. Reese had driven 4 hours from Charlotte. He had brought flowers. He had been attentive and warm and present in a way that my grandmother, who had spent a decade working around his absence, may have found more moving than she should have. I don't know exactly what was said that afternoon. I know what was signed 6 weeks later. Daniel died on a Thursday morning in October. It was quiet. The room was small and it smelled like the lotion the nurses used and something metallic underneath that I have never been able to name. I held his hand and I watched his breathing change and then stop, and I stayed in that chair for a long time afterward because leaving the room felt like something I couldn't undo. My parents came the next day. My mother held me in the kitchen and cried. My father stood in the doorway and looked at his shoes the way men do when they're feeling something they don't have the architecture to express. Reese sent flowers and called twice and said he would come when things settled. Things never settled into an arrangement that required his presence. Eleanor called me the evening of Daniel's funeral. Her voice was different. Thinner, somehow. Like something had gone out of it. "I'm sorry I couldn't be there," she said. "You don't need to be sorry," I told her. "I am though," she said. "For more than that." And then she stopped in a way that made me want to ask what she meant. But she sounded so tired. And I was so tired. And there would be time to ask later. There wasn't. Eleanor died 11 days after Daniel. In her sleep, in her own bed, in the yellow house on Birchwood Lane. Agnes called me at 6 in the morning. I drove to Birchwood in a fog that I don't fully remember navigating. I sat on the porch in one of the rocking chairs and looked at the empty chair beside me and felt the particular loneliness of losing the last person who had called every single day. My parents handled the arrangements. I helped where I could. Reese flew in for the funeral, stayed 2 nights, and flew back. He was solicitous and appropriate and present in the performed way he was always present when there was an audience. At the reception, he stood with my parents and received condolences as though he had been there all along. Several people told him what a wonderful grandson he had been. He accepted this without correcting them. I washed dishes in my grandmother's kitchen and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the room was ready to hear. The will reading was scheduled for a Friday morning, 10 days after Eleanor's funeral, at the office of her attorney, a man named Howard Briggs who had handled my grandmother's affairs for over 20 years. I arrived at 9. My parents were already there. Reese sat beside my father in a charcoal jacket with his hands folded on the table like a man who already knew the agenda. I noticed that. I noticed it and I filed it and I sat down across from him and waited. Howard Briggs was a quiet man with reading glasses on a chain and a manner that suggested he had delivered difficult news enough times that he had learned to do it without flinching. He opened his folder. He read the preliminary language. And then he paused in a way that wasn't procedural. He looked at me over his glasses. "Clara," he said, "before I proceed, I want to make sure you have the full picture." I said nothing. My hands were very still. "Your grandmother made amendments to her estate documents 6 weeks before her death," he said. "The amendments were executed legally and witnessed. I want to be straightforward with you about what they contain." He told me. The yellow house on Birchwood Lane, the savings account, the investment portfolio my grandfather had built over 40 years of careful living, total value approximately $740,000, had been restructured. Reese was named primary beneficiary of the estate. I had been designated a single specific bequest. My grandmother's rocking chair. One of the 2 from the front porch. The room was very quiet. My mother was looking at the table. My father had his hands flat on his thighs the way he sat when he was bracing for something. Reese was looking at Howard Briggs with an expression of careful neutrality that I recognized as rehearsed. I looked at the rocking chair bequest on the document Howard slid toward me. My grandmother's handwriting was not on it. The amendments were typed. Witnessed by 2 signatures I didn't recognize. "I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a moment where the shock was so complete that your body simply didn't respond to it? Where you sat perfectly still not because you were composed but because the signal hadn't traveled from your mind to your hands yet?" That was me. In that chair. In that office. 10 days after my grandmother's funeral. 21 days after my husband's. I asked Howard one question. "When were these amendments executed?" He told me the date. 6 weeks before Eleanor's death. 3 weeks after my parents' visit to Birchwood. 2 weeks after Daniel's 4th round of treatment. While I was in a waiting room with a paper cup of bad coffee, my grandmother had been in this office signing documents that gave everything to my brother. I said nothing else at the will reading. I thanked Howard. I stood up. I put on my coat. I walked past my brother without looking at him. My mother said my name once in the hallway. I kept walking. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 23 minutes. I know the number because I watched the clock. I needed to know how long it took for my hands to stop shaking. Then I called the only person I could think to call. My grandmother's neighbor, Agnes Whitfield, had lived next door to Eleanor for 31 years. She was the one who called me at 6 in the morning when she found her. She was the one who let me into the yellow house with the spare key Eleanor had given her years ago for emergencies. Agnes, I said, I need to ask you something about the afternoon my parents and Reese visited. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I was wondering when you'd call. Here is what Agnes told me. She had been gardening that afternoon, close to the fence line between the properties. She hadn't meant to overhear anything. But the windows in Eleanor's living room were open and voices carry in October when the leaves are down. She heard Reese's voice. She heard words she didn't fully understand at the time. Trust restructuring. Simplified estate. She heard my grandmother's voice, quieter. She heard my name mentioned once. She heard my mother say, Clara has Daniel to worry about. She can't manage a property right now. This is the practical thing. She heard my grandmother say nothing after that. Agnes told me something else. She said that 3 days after that visit, she had knocked on Eleanor's door with a casserole and found her sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her and an expression Agnes had never seen on her face in 31 years. What kind of expression? I asked. Like someone who had agreed to something they weren't sure about, Agnes said. She asked me to sit down. We had coffee. She kept looking at that paper. I didn't ask what it was. I should have asked. I thanked Agnes. I sat with what she told me for 3 days. Then I called Howard Briggs and asked for a meeting. Not about the will itself. About the process. Howard Briggs was an ethical man. I understood this from how carefully he chose his words. He could not share privileged information about the circumstances of the amendments. But he could answer hypothetical questions about the general standards governing estate document execution in our state. I asked those questions carefully. He answered them carefully. When I left his office the second time, I had 3 things I hadn't had before. An understanding of what undue influence meant in estate law. The name of an estate litigation attorney named Patricia Okafor, which Howard had written on a notepad and slid across the desk without commentary. And a memory I had almost let go of. My grandmother, the evening before I left after my last visit, standing in her kitchen doorway. Clara, she had said. The bottom drawer of the desk in the study. There's an envelope in there with your name on it. I put it there when my handwriting was still good. I had laughed. Your handwriting is still good, Grandma. Humor me, she had said. And she had smiled in a way that hadn't quite reached her eyes. I had forgotten about the envelope. I had forgotten about it because Daniel came home from treatment that week with a fever, and I had forgotten about everything that wasn't immediately in front of me. I drove to Birchwood Lane on a Tuesday afternoon. Agnes let me in without a word and stood on the porch while I went inside. The yellow house was exactly as Eleanor had left it. Coffee smell fading. Pillows straight. A library book on the end table with a bookmark 2/3 of the way through. The study was at the back of the house. Small, practical, a desk her husband had built and she had never replaced. I opened the bottom drawer. The envelope was there. My name on the front in blue ink, her handwriting from before the tremor got worse. I sat down in the desk chair and I opened it. It was 4 pages. Written over what I guessed was several sittings, the ink changing slightly between sections, some lines more careful than others. I am not going to give you every word. Those words are mine. But I will tell you what mattered. My grandmother knew what she had signed. She wrote that clearly. She also wrote that she had signed it because she was tired and because they had come on a day when she was especially tired and because my mother had used a particular word that Eleanor had never been able to argue against. Practical. Eleanor had grown up during a time when being practical was the highest virtue a woman could demonstrate. And my mother, who had known Eleanor for 40 years, knew exactly which key opened that particular door. She wrote that she had regretted it within the week. She had called Howard Briggs. But Reese had already been to see him, and by the time she expressed her uncertainty, Reese had suggested that changing the documents again would create confusion and upset the family during an already difficult time. And Eleanor had been tired. And Daniel was sick. And she hadn't wanted to add to what I was carrying. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote it 3 times in 3 different places in the letter, which told me how much she meant it. She also wrote something else. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in the careful handwriting she used when something mattered, she had written this. I kept a record, Clara. Not because I planned any of this. Because I have always kept records of things that matter to me. Howard has a copy of the original documents, the ones before the amendments. He has my letter to him expressing doubt. He has the date I called. He has the date Reese visited his office. He is an ethical man. He will answer honest questions honestly. The 4th page was a single paragraph. A description of a second envelope at Howard's office, held in a file with my name on it, sealed and separate from the estate documents, left at Eleanor's instruction 9 months before the amendments were ever signed. I drove back to Howard Briggs' office that same afternoon. He had been expecting me, he said, since my second visit. He gave me the envelope. Inside was a document I had not known existed. A letter of intent, signed by my grandmother, witnessed and notarized, dated 9 months before the amendments, stating clearly that it was her wish that the yellow house on Birchwood Lane pass to me, and describing in plain language her reasons. That I had been present. That I had shown up. That I knew which window stuck and how to bleed the radiator and that the bookshelves were organized by color because it made the room feel warmer. She hadn't been able to make it legally binding the way a trust would have been. But she had left me a record. A clear, witnessed, notarized record of her original intent, her doubt about the amendments, and the timeline of events. Patricia Okafor reviewed everything within a week. The standard for undue influence, she told me, requires demonstrating that the testator's free will was overborne by another party. It is not easy to prove. It is not impossible either. She laid out what we had. The original letter of intent. Eleanor's letter to Howard expressing doubt. The timeline of Reese's visit and the subsequent amendment. Agnes's account of what she had overheard. The speed of the process. The witnesses on the amendment who had no prior relationship to my grandmother. None of it is a guarantee, Patricia said. But it is a coherent narrative. And coherent narratives have weight. I want to be honest with you about the months that followed because they were not triumphant. They were slow and expensive and exhausting in a way that sat on top of the existing exhaustion of grief like a second weather system. I was also, during this time, still working. Still returning sympathy cards. Still sleeping in the house Daniel and I had shared and learning the particular silence of rooms that used to have 2 people in them. Patricia filed a formal challenge to the estate amendments in probate court. The grounds were undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity, the latter supported by medical records indicating that Eleanor had been prescribed a new anxiety medication 3 weeks before the amendments were signed, a medication whose side effects included increased susceptibility to suggestion and impaired decision-making. Reese hired an attorney. My parents did not. They were not technically parties to the suit. But their presence in the situation was impossible to ignore, and Patricia made sure it wasn't ignored. The deposition phase was the hardest part. I sat across a table from my brother in a conference room and listened to him explain, in careful measured language, that he had simply been trying to help his elderly grandmother simplify her affairs. That he had been concerned about her capacity to manage a property. That my mother had raised the idea and he had agreed it made sense. That he had not pressured anyone. He was composed. He was credible. He was the best version of a man who had done something wrong and decided the most effective response was to believe his own revision of events. I looked at him across that table and felt something I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not vindication. Sadness. The specific sadness of recognizing that the person across from you is never going to be who you needed them to be, and that this was always going to be true, and that you had just not been paying the right kind of attention. My father's deposition was 17 minutes long. He answered questions quietly and without elaboration. He said he had thought it was the practical thing. He said the word practical the way my grandmother had written it. Like something he had borrowed from someone else and was still not entirely sure fit him. My mother's deposition lasted considerably longer. She was articulate and thoroughly prepared. She described her concern for Eleanor's well-being. She described the burden of property management for a woman in declining health. She described me, carefully and without malice in her tone, as someone who was overwhelmed and probably not in a position to take on additional responsibility. She did not mention Daniel by name. Not once. In a deposition about an estate that had been restructured while my husband was dying, my mother described my circumstances without once saying his name. Patricia noted this in her summary. Juries notice omissions. The case did not go to a full trial. 14 months after Patricia filed the challenge, Reese's attorney contacted her with a proposed settlement. I will not tell you the exact terms. Some things stay between the parties and the documents. What I will tell you is this. The yellow house on Birchwood Lane came back to me. Not as a bequest. Not as a courtesy. As a legal resolution. Recorded at the county recorder's office on a Wednesday morning in the same month that would have been my grandmother's 83rd birthday. I drove to Birchwood Lane that afternoon alone. Agnes was in her garden. She looked up when she saw my car. I didn't have to say anything. She just nodded once and went back to her plants. I unlocked the front door with the key I had never stopped carrying. I sat in my chair on the porch. I looked at the empty one beside me for a long time. Then I went inside and made coffee. Reese and I do not have a relationship. There was no final confrontation. No scene at a dinner table. We simply exist in a reduced proximity now, navigating the distance between us with a politeness that substitutes for something that was never quite there to begin with. My parents and I have something more complicated. My mother called me 3 months after the settlement. Her voice was reduced somehow. Like pressure had been let out. She said, I want you to know I thought we were doing the right thing. I said, I know you did, Mom. She said, I should have called you. During all of it. I should have just called you. I said, yes. We talked for 19 minutes. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a resolution. It was two people trying to find the edges of something they had both broken from different sides and figure out whether the shape of what remained was worth keeping. I think it might be. I'm still deciding. My father called once, separately, on a Sunday morning. He didn't say much. He asked if I was all right. I said I was getting there. He said he thought about Daniel sometimes. He said he hadn't said that enough when he should have. I told him that was enough to hear. It was. I live in the yellow house on Birchwood Lane now. Partly. I kept the house in Asheville. I go back and forth. There is something about moving between two places that felt wrong at first and then felt right, like occupying two parts of myself that I had been keeping separate. The garden here is mine now. I don't have Daniel's instinct for it, but I am learning. Agnes comes over sometimes and tells me what things need. She brings casseroles she doesn't need a reason to bring. I organized the bookshelves by color. It makes the room feel warmer. My grandmother was right about that. There is a second rocking chair on the porch. The one that was always there. I haven't moved it. I don't intend to. Sometimes in the morning, When the light comes through the pines at a certain angle and the coffee is hot and the world is quiet enough to let you think, I sit on that porch and I feel something I spent a long time being afraid I wouldn't feel again. Solid. Like ground that holds. My grandmother could not stop what happened. She was 81 and tired and alone in a room with people who had decided what was practical. But she had called every day for a year. She had left an envelope in a bottom drawer. She had written 4 pages in blue ink on the days when her handwriting was still good. She had done everything she could with what she had. That is what love looks like when it cannot be loud. It makes records. It leaves envelopes. It calls every morning to tell you what the cardinal outside the kitchen window has been doing. It gives you something to hold on to when the people who were supposed to protect you are busy deciding what is practical. I kept the letter. All 4 pages. It lives in the desk her husband built, in the drawer where she left the envelope for me. Some days I don't open it. Some days I do. Either way, it is there. The same way she was always there. Quietly, without asking anything in return, waiting for me to show up. If someone in your life has ever done something quietly to protect you, even something small, tell them. Don't wait for a resolution or a moment when the room is finally ready to hear it. Tell them now. That's my story. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me about someone who showed up for you when they didn't have to. Hit subscribe. And I'll see you in the next one.